and welcome to this very, very special Ask With Forum. I think we're going to hear some terrific reminiscences and celebrations of Gerry Lesser over the next hour and a half or so here. But in a way, it's hard to imagine a more enthusiastic and robust tribute to Gerry's memory and the fact that all of you are here. Thank you so much for braving these elements and ignoring forecasts and whatever craziness was required to struggle here, and it's just terrific to see so many people. And as I say, we are here to honor our departed colleague, teacher, friend, and inspiration. Departed in fact, but I'd like to think not in spirit. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have Gerry smiling down at us from both sides of the hall, that sort of unforgettable and irrepressible smile that I think we all probably associate with Gerry. I want to bid a special welcome to Stella Lesser and to son Ted and daughter Nina and her family who are here in the front row. And I also want to say a special thank you to Dean Kathy McCartney of the School of Education, who made possible this major assembly of people. So thank you for honoring Gerry in this way. And I must also, if you'll indulge me, mention Tricia Brown and Jody Smith-Bennett from the Development and Alumni Relations Office. Many of you corresponded with one of them in making plans. They put a terrific effort into making this happen. As I thought about this day over the past several months, actually, I came to realize that a memorial is an unusual kind of event. It's not a funeral. It's very much a chance to recall, I hope, with pleasure as well as sadness. That's why I called this event Celebrating Gerry Lesser, because I think we should all feel good and licensed to tell the kind of stories, kind of funny stories, and to laugh as part of this memorial, as well as to reconnect with the sorrow of losing Gerry. And I also realized that this is not just a memorial, but a reunion. In fact, 3 overlapping reunions of people who studied with Gerry and taught with Gerry here at the Ed School, of people who worked over almost 40 years with Gerry at Sesame Workshop, and of people who are also fellow researchers and students of children and media who published with Gerry or did research with Gerry or learned from Gerry. And so I think it's terrific that we'll have a chance over today and tomorrow to get reacquainted, in some cases over decades of not having seen one another. In fact, what I've gathered from the forecast is that those of you who will be here tomorrow should have plenty of time to have a reunion. This afternoon we have 2 panels of folks who have had a chance to prepare some recollections and reflections. So I'm going to keep my own comments here very short. I just want to say that Gerry Lesser introduced me to Sesame Street when I wasn't a whole lot older than the show's target audience. I was working here at the Ed School at a summer job in college. And when I first met Gerry, very quickly learned one critical lesson from him, which I'm really sad to confess that I'm betraying today, and that is that if you care about the work enough, you can get away with sneakers and a sweater anywhere. In fact, I thought maybe at this point in my talk I would actually take off my tie and jacket, but then I thought you might worry that I was confusing Mr. Rogers. So I'm not going to do that. And then Gerry inspired really my entire career, first doing educational media at WGBH and elsewhere for PBS. And he inspired it by making 3 lessons really clear to me. One is that even though it's for kids, making media can be as intellectually demanding, challenging, and engaging as any other task you can imagine. Secondly, that it can be a way to contribute not just to learning, but to social progress and actually social justice. And third, that making educational media can be really cool and a lot of fun to do. So that set me going on first phase of my career. And then Gerry brought me back to teach here. So I thought about his role in my life, I realized I basically owe it all to him. And it's been amazing to spend the last 2 months thinking about this day and being kind of feeling connected with him every day. The last thing I want to share with you is that I had the amazing privilege of a long telephone conversation with Gerry on the weekend before he died. And if you want to know what we talked about you. We talked about, just like every other conversation with Gerry, it was about his pride, his continuing interest, his investment in the people he taught, the people he worked with here, and the people he worked with at the workshop. So we talked about Education Nation, Mil Chen's new insightful book. We talked about Anne Sweeney and the important work she's doing in the commercial sector, but still paying great attention to children in media. We talked about his friends Howard Gardner and Kurt Fisher and Bob Selman and what they were doing, continuing to do here at the Ed School. We talked about his pleasure in meeting you, Kathy, and how much he thinks, how much he thought of what you're doing in leadership for the school. And we talked about the current students who are here. Gerry's pleasure in the fact that it's possible and exciting to continue to study media, educational media, and learning technology here at the Ed School. So I'm really grateful that we had the chance for that final conversation. Grateful for all that Gerry has meant to me. So that's it for me. I want to turn to our first panel. You know, the event is titled Celebrating Gerry Lesser, From Appian Way to Sesame Street and the World. This first panel is handling the first 2/3 of that assignment, talking about Appian Way and Sesame Street. As you know from your program, our first speaker was going to be kind of an anchor for Gerry here on Appian Way. Bob Levine, longtime professor, Larson professor here, the head of the Lab of Human Development. Bob unfortunately couldn't make it due to the weather, and I thought in the spirit of things, rather than my reading his short remarks that he was able to send, I've asked a current student to share them with you. So Alexis, will you come up and read for us what Bob Levine sent to?
Good evening. Gerry Lesser was a creative force in education. Here on Appian Way, he created the leading program in the U.S. relating child development to education. When he took over as director of the Laboratory of Human Development from John Whiting in 1963, it had been a one-man show devoted to cross-cultural research. In 10 years, Gerry added 5 senior professors: Jean Shaw, Shep White, Larry Kohlberg, Courtney Kasdan, and B. Whiting, representing a variety of educational specialists ranging from reading and language to moral development and the cultural context of childhood. Rather than trying to control or even coordinate these distinguished scholars, Gerry let them run their own shops, as he did his own children's television, so long as they participated in the pro-seminar for incoming doctoral students. The resulting intellectual excitement and educational innovations were incomparable. I joined the faculty in 1976, replacing Shep White after his move into the psychology department. And the following year, I became, as Gerry had been, the titular chair of human development, but the shops remained autonomous. Though the house that Gerry Lesser built was later renovated, its loose structure, capacity for innovation, and educational significance remained as he constructed it. And his institutional legacy to the Harvard Graduate School of Education will forever endure. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the rest of the Appian Way story is going to come from Hobbs professor Howard Gardner.
Thanks, Joe. Am I audible? Well, I'm very touched to have an opportunity to talk a bit about Gerry and the presence of his family and so many of his friends. And I hope that if I knew you, you'll come up and say hello, because I'm not very good in faces, but I'd feel frustrated if I didn't have a chance to connect to people here. Gerry was a wonderful person, a wonderful human being. I don't know of any negatives that anybody had about him, and that's pretty unusual, particularly in this part of the world. Many of us were friends of his and colleagues of his. But being a half a generation younger, I was really a mentee of his. And I learned a tremendous amount from Gerry. We got to know each other very, very well on a project called the Project on Human Potential, also known as the Van Leer Project, which was one of the largest projects ever carried out at the Ed School, and it involved many people, including some people I see here today, and travel all around the world. It was an amazing project, and Gerry was exactly the right person to be the chairman of the steering committee, because as he was unflappable, and as Bob Levine's words said, he let people define what they wanted to do and help them to get along. I want to talk about two professional lessons and two personal lessons which I, as a mentee, was able to get from Gerry. Lesson number one was very, very important, and it actually comes from a challenging part of Gerry's life. Just before he came here, he had done a study of the varying profiles of intellectual abilities among different groups in New York City, different ethnic and racial groups. It was a very important, very well-done study, but it had been misunderstood and perverted in ways that made it very, very, very difficult for him. I was, at the time, studying different kinds of intelligence, as many of you know, and Gerry said you have to be very, very careful that what you're saying is not misunderstood. And I took away from this the idea of never making any kinds of statements about differences among groups. And in 30 years, I've never talked about what you would find from one racial ethnic group and profiles of intelligence as opposed to the other because of the chances of misunderstanding. So that was a tremendous professional mentoring lesson I got from Gerry. The second one is much lighter. I used to show Gerry research grant applications. In fact, going through my correspondence, I found this little penciled remarks. And he said, Howard, let me tell you a trick. He said, when you figure out exactly what you want to do, leave out 10% of it. Because the grant maker wants to feel that he or she has some efficacy. If you leave a hole big enough for them to discover, not only will they feel good, but you'll be more likely to get the grant. So two personal lessons. In 1980, Gerry and I and Harry Lasker and a few other people were among the first people from Harvard to have an official visit to China. And China could not have been more different then than it was now. It was really just coming out of the Cultural Revolution. It was very, very backward. And in Beijing, we stayed at what has to be one of the worst hotels known to men and women, called the Bayway Hotel. Some of you will remember this. And this is the point of NPR when they say, now, the next part's going to be a little bit violent, so put your fingers in your ear. When I told my wife Ellen about the other day, I couldn't stop laughing, because this was the time when Chinese men would spit in spittoons. But if there were no spittoons, then you simply spit on the ground. And there was a mixed shower for everybody. There weren't any personal showers in the Bayway Hotel. As you were showering, you had to avoid the spit that the men were putting all over the floor. And Gerry created a ballet to show you how do you shower in the Bayway Hotel. And to this day, I can see him hopping around to avoid the lesson here was Gerry liked good hotels, he liked good wine, he liked comfort, but it was go with the punches when you're traveling. And he traveled to probably more countries at that time than anybody on television, and he knew you weren't always going to be at the Four Seasons. Sometimes you were going to be at the Bayway, but you could survive there as well. The other lesson is one which all of us know, but we too often forget. And I took this from Gerry, and it's with me all the time. And that is, find the time to enjoy yourself with people whom you like, in places that you like, in times that you have free. And for him, I was lucky enough to go with him there a few times, going to the Carnegie Deli in New York City, with people whom you liked, eating what you liked, pastrami, whatever, smoking your cigar was a tremendous high point. And I could see Gerry enjoying it. And now, and I'm not making this up for the occasion, Whenever I go to New York, we have 3 kids living. We go to the Carnegie Deli or some other deli like the 2nd Avenue Deli, and there's no time like it. It's just wonderful. So I'm tremendously grateful as a mentee to Gerry, both for the professional lessons about avoiding misunderstanding and what I would call the 10% rule for those foundation officers, and these 2 personal lessons. When you travel, try to get the best, but go with the flow, and if it's the Bay Way, make a ballet out of it. And before it's too late, spend time with people you love in a setting that you like and enjoy.
That's great. And of course, the last point people can act on right away because of the reunion aspect of this. People will be able to spend some time today with people they really care about. Well, before we make the transition to our guests from Sesame Workshop, I just want to interject that, so Gerry Lesser was here teaching, doing research, 1967 or so. We'll hear the actual story. Earlier, got involved with what became Sesame Street. In 1968, when Sesame Street was still a year from being broadcast, there had to be some way to introduce this idea to the public television stations that had to be persuaded to carry it. And so what was then the Children's Television Workshop produced what they called internally, I believe, a sales film to get the idea of Sesame out to the stations. And we have a little clip of that to look at now. So if we could have that, Jason.
Yeah, I like that, you know, but little kitty can mean any child up to the age of 7 and 8. Now, I think we should aim this show right at the preschooler.
Well, then how about the itty-bitty, nitty-gritty little kitty, Joe? Like that?
But we shouldn't aim at either just the city kids or the country kids. So we call it the itty-bitty farm and city witty-titty nitty-gritty dog and kitty pretty little kitty show.
Does anybody at the Children's TV Workshop know what he's doing? Or are you just doing the whole thing with your little doggy brain?
If you just pay attention, Kermit, I'm trying to tell you.
Easy, boy, easy. You need a booster for your distemper shot there.
Oh, wait a minute. Hey, Gerry, you got a minute? Sure. Here's Gerry Lesser. He's the chairman of the advisory board to the workshop. Hey, Gerry. Kermit, this is Dr. Lesser of the Harvard University School of Education.
Hello. How do you do, sir?
Gerry, could you help us by explaining to Kermit here how they're putting this program together?
Oh, I think so. Let's see. First of all, back in the summer of 1968, we held a series of seminars with the workshop staff and all kinds of teachers and sociologists, child psychologists, literally hundreds of people who know and care about teaching preschool children.
Those seminars kind of tuned the TV people into the education world. Is that it?
Exactly. Then those TV people went home and started thinking about the program. Now, say they get an idea for a little cartoon to teach the letter J, okay?
Okay.
So they check out every idea with as many experts as possible before going ahead with it.
Isn't that crazy? Well, what if the experts tell them it's a bomb?
Well, they throw it out and start again. But if they're on the right track, they incorporate the advisor's suggestions and go to work making the film.
What's happening, man? I don't know. What's that? I don't know. Looks like a fish hook.
It's not a fish hook. It's a J.
What?
The letter J. Like to hear a story about the letter J, boys?
Yeah.
Once upon a time, a guy named Joe noticed a June bug on his toe. Put it in a jar and started to go. But here come the judge and said, no, no, no. So Joe said why and started to jump and danced a jig on an old tree stump. Then jogged along to the city dump where he jammed the June bug in a tire pump. Then the judge caught up and started to wail and said to Joe, justice will prevail. Then the jury met and set the bail, and Joe got an hour in the city jail.
So that's the letter J. It still looks like a fish hook. You know what else we learned? Yeah, don't jab a death by jamming a June bug.
Yeah, but that's not all. Even now, before it goes into the program, the film is tested on a sample audience.
How's it tested?
Oh, I'll show you.
We saw a story on television about one of these. Can you find one we saw a story about? Good. Which one do you think we saw a story about? You pick it up and give it to me. Which one do you think we saw a story about? That's good. What is it? A J, right.
That explain things, Ralph?
That's terrific. Thanks, Jerry.
Glad I could help.
Sesame Street. I love it. The kids will love it. I can see it. Up there in lights, the Children's Television Workshop presents Sesame Street. Oh, that's a great title, Kermit.
So part of the research that you saw there at the end was really pioneered by the folks at the Children's Television Workshop, and one of those pioneers is here with us. So Keith Mielke, why don't you take over? Is your microphone on, by the way? Just make sure.
Gerry Lesser was part of my life for well over 20 years. It was 1972 when I first met him at the Children's Television Workshop. I was on a Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellowship, specifically to study the formative research methods at the CTW. Gerry was establishing the Center for Research in Children's Television around that time, sometime in the early 70s. Well, learning about Gerry's work and this new center was like catnip to me. At the time, I was a faculty member of Indiana University and becoming increasingly interested in evaluating research. So I applied to Gerry for the opportunity to spend a sabbatical year with him in 1973-74 here at Harvard. That year with Gerry Lesser was truly a pivotal point in my transition from university professor to CTW staff member. At CTW, Gerry Lesser and Ed Palmer were my two role models as I went full-time in the summer of 77. Ed Palmer was CTW's first research director. He was the person who, among other things, developed the original distractor method for measuring attention to a television show. Gerry developed the general model into which the formative research methods like that would be incorporated. These two men were the Sesame Street research pioneers. They established the processes that have been used ever since. As Sesame Street neared its 20th anniversary, there was an opportunity to take a fresh look at how Sesame Street was performing. Society was changing a lot, but so was Sesame Street. Were we still reaching the inner city audience? Would we be able to see some form of long-term effects of the series? With a little help from our friends, Gerry and I organized a 2-day research symposium at the ETS campus in Princeton. We heard reports from leading scholars and went on to introduce a number of new research studies on Sesame Street. Some of the participants in that conference are here today. Gerry's contributions to the development of Sesame Street are, of course, well established in the literature, but maybe less well known or appreciated is his work with other CTW series that were targeted children 6 to 9 years of age. The series 3-2-1 Contact, for example, dealt with science education. And Square One TV dealt with mathematics. And Ghost Rider dealt with literacy. Gerry was involved in all of them. And we used basically the same methods that had been pioneered with Sesame Street. Gerry spent a lot of time in the CTW organization, but the formal organizational chart by no means restricted or contained him. He was free at will to float completely through the organization, from Joan Cooney's office to the newest staff member. This free-ranging access gave Gerry a lot of influence in the organization. Gerry Lesser had so many wonderful qualities. He was a kind and courteous man. One talent that I always envied was his ability to make detailed instructions and introductions for an entire room full of people without any reference to notes. I really wish I could do that. He was masterful in running meetings. He was never stiff and formal, but casual and friendly. Gerry Lesser has left a big impression on the world of children's television, and he's had an enormous influence on me personally. And I'm grateful for the opportunity I had to know him and to work with him.
Thank you, Keith. And Keith mentioned some of those other great Sesame Workshop productions besides Sesame Street. Many of you know them all, I'm sure, well. The one you didn't mention is the one that was created by our next panelist, the electric company, Sam Gibbon. I'm so glad you're here.
I just want to add a quick note about...
I'm not sure your mic is on, Sam.
Oh, sorry. Forgot my instruction.
Was you a TV producer? We had people who did the thing. The video that Joe introduced, it reminds me of some other friends who have departed. And I sort of imagine a conference room someplace ethereal that has not only Gerry, but Dave Connell, who supervised the animation that you saw, John Stone, who wrote those pieces, and Jim Henson, who was the puppeteer. They and a sadly long list of others have departed. It's sort of strange to be a survivor after all these years. Gerry, I met Gerry in the spring of 1968, just before the second of the curriculum seminars that he referred to. I missed the first one on social, moral, and affective development because I was pursuing my own social, moral, and affective development on my honeymoon. I was there for the second and subsequent seminars, and they were absolutely amazing. Nobody thought that they would work. I mean, the notion that egocentric television people who fancy themselves artistes could actually communicate with egocentric professors who thought of themselves as the fountain of wisdom was just unimaginable. Nobody thought it would work. And it worked brilliantly because of Gerry. Gerry didn't do it alone, of course. He had all kinds of help from the Brain Trust of Lloyd Morissette and Joan Cooney and Dave Connell and later Ed Palmer. But he set the tone and the agenda. He recruited the participants. Again, not alone, but he knew everybody, and he knew who was good and who wasn't, and who should be there and who would make a contribution and who wouldn't. And so those seminars were Gerry's show, and they were absolutely amazing. Gerry, Keith mentioned his memory trick. Gerry would come in and he'd sit at the head of the table. There was no question who was boss. He sat at the head of the table, not anywhere else. He took his jacket off, loosened his tie, rolled his sleeves up, literally, and opened his notebook in front of him. And the message was clear. We were there to work, no pretension was going to be allowed. And then he would do this amazing thing. In a room full of 30 people, he would go around the room and name everybody and say what their job was and describe their work. Without a note, without any, he must have spent days memorizing their faces and information, but it was stunning. And in case anybody had any doubt about who was in charge, that erased it. He was it. His manner in those meetings, he was the best meeting chairman any of us have ever seen at work. He welcomed ideas from any source. Nobody was beneath attention. And if he heard a good idea, he would underline it. If somebody in the room who might have an interest in the topic that was being discussed but hadn't spoken up yet, he would turn to that person and invite their participation. It was fantastic, and as a result,
many of us made friends across that bridge that everybody thought couldn't be crossed, that continued until we all started to die off. Shep White, for example, was as good a friend to me and to the show staff as anybody else. He contributed show ideas, he advised us on our curriculum, but he also was a friend, and excuse me. Did somebody say turn off your hips? I'm sorry. Then Gerry invited me to come up here and as a producer in residence for the Center on Children's Television, Center for Research in Children's Television. And it was a transformative experience for me. I spent 2 years here, and they were 2 of the best years of my professional life. I loved it here. I loved the life, the people, the students, the work, the ideas. And Gerry was, Howard spoke of him as a mentor. For me, as a total outsider, I'd never been inside a graduate school, let alone worked in one. He was the negotiator. He negotiated the funding. He negotiated all the ins and outs of the bureaucracy. He made life wonderful and pleasant. And whenever I didn't know what to do or how to conduct myself, he was always available to guide me. The thing that I remember thinking about him now, one of the things that's most salient about him is how neat he was. He was a very tidy man. He never needed a haircut. His glasses were never dirty. His handwriting was so tidy as to beggar description. Everything he wrote down was economical. He never wasted a word, and tidy. And the thing that I eventually came to realize was that this reflected the character of his mind. He had a tidy mind. It was very well organized. He was never at a loss for a good idea. And I owe a whole lot of my professional life to Gerry, and it was an enormous pleasure to know him and to work with him, and I miss him a lot.
And having heard about early days and middle days at the workshop, I'm very delighted that we have with us the man who carries the banner of the workshop today, the president and CEO of Sesame Workshop, Gerry Lesser.
Well, I'm deeply honored to be here, and I want to especially thank the Lesser family for sharing Gerry with us for so many years. I want to talk a little bit about the impact that continues that Gerry really started. He had a profound impact, not just on the workshop, but as you can see out here today from everyone here, he trailblazed a path for an entire industry from one shore, which was entertainment, to the other one, which is about education. He was affable, ever-present, not quiet. His demeanor, I guess, must have been birthed on the streets of New York City, from whence he came. His street smarts found their ways all the way, Howard, to this esteemed institution. And even though he achieved much academically to get here in the first place, I'm convinced that his origins is what kept him close to his customers, who were the children of America, especially those who strive for a chance to succeed in life, and later taking that to all the kids around the world. He was able to challenge the conventional wisdom at the time that television couldn't teach, that the idiot box, as it was known in my household, was forever going to be exiled to some place in the land of time-killing, mind-numbing behavioral reinforcement. The must be a course on that somewhere. He challenged the early academic excursions into television by pointing out that television wasn't just like a toaster with pictures, but where you could have stagnant images of teachers in front of blackboards writing in a classroom. It wasn't just about holding up a camera in a classroom, but it was about figuring out what it was about television that was entertaining people and keeping them hooked. He pushed people to view the TV as something organic in itself. It was a technological species which had been invented, which lived under its own rules of engagement. It was no longer about film in the classroom. It was now about the power of song, humor, and razzle-dazzle to pull kids in, along with their co-viewing parents in what became a virtuous circle of education and engagement. Gerry was able to corral writers, as Sam was mentioning, directors, actors, and puppeteers into the same room with lots of PhDs, and professors, government officials, and yes, even blue-suited executives. Sometimes it was like a corporate boardroom. Sometimes it was the bar scene from Star Wars. But he made it work with a forceful gavel and a clear direction of where it needed to end up. It was always about reminding the very opinionated people in the room, and I was in some of those rooms, who would love to impress each other on the particular cause or philosophy they were promoting, that it wasn't about them. It was about the 4-year-old child in Roxbury or Rochester or Rio de Janeiro. These content seminars, as they became to be known, were a signature of the CTW model, now the Sesame Workshop model, which incorporates educational pedagogy into television scripts improved upon by constant research. This model is now used by many organizations today, and I'm proud that my colleagues have used this same model that Gerry invented this year in places like Islamabad, Pakistan, Lagos, Nigeria, and Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. For Gerry Lesser set the standard for education's intersection with media. And one final note for which we should remember this leadership. He didn't take offense to criticism, and there was criticism. One Sesame Street critic, I love this one, this is my favorite, described it as, quote, phony pedagogy, vulgar sideshows, bad acting, and layers of smoke and fog to clog the eager minds of small children, unquote. And that was one of the most pleasant comments. In his 1974 book, Gerry acknowledged that the workshop monitored its criticism partly, and I quote, in the hope that we could discover ways to improve Sesame Street. Gerry, who is here today, Gerry, you made us better, and millions of young children have benefited from your steadfast focus on seeing the possible, not accepting mediocrity, and reminding all of us of our awesome responsibility in remembering who we worked for. Let us honor him and indeed never forget who it is that we do work for. Thanks.
Say it's really great hearing all these tributes and recollections, and Gerry, then you look back at the pictures and you can see it all in these pictures, the smile and the pointing and the commanding of the room and so on. Thank you all very much. We're going to invite you to take your seats, leave your microphones, please, because we do have another panel. It's certainly not lost on me, as I'm sure not on you, that so far the event has been one gender, but that's only because some of our other important guests couldn't make it here due to the weather. And in just a second, I want to share with you a video that was sent, of course, because she couldn't be here from Joan Gans Cooney. As you've heard and as you know, Joan, along with Lloyd Morissette, was really Gerry, the three that imagined the Children's Television Workshop and made all these things happen that we've been recollecting. So I'm sorry Joan couldn't be here with us. She, of course, is sorry she couldn't be here to see you, but she has sent us her thoughts.
Good evening. I'm very sorry I can't be with you tonight, but I did want to say a few words about Gerry. When we began the Children's Television Workshop, we were proposing that material as it was produced, that it be tested on target audiences for both appeal and educational value. The researchers were to report back to the producers, and they were to modify or discard material based on these almost continuous reports from the field. In other words, we were proposing that the roles of guesswork and luck be cut down by something very much akin to science. Many people expressed skepticism that researchers, academics, and producers could work amicably together. In the creation of this pioneering model, we had to start somewhere, and that somewhere was with Gerry Lesser. Lloyd and I knew personally most of the leading people in the field of educational psychology. When we drew up our lists of possibles for the chairman role, we didn't even discuss it. It was understood that Gerry was it. Gerry was not wholly enthusiastic about the project. He brought the same skepticism to my emotional conviction that television could teach, that any good scientist brings to an amateur's passion. But because he was one of the very few educational psychologists around who had worked in television, Ed Palmer, who became head of research at the workshop, was another, Gerry finally said yes. Gerry came up with the idea of 5 seminars to be held in Boston and New York, during which the producers, artists, writers, and puppeteers, and those who would be working with them, would be educated as to the needs of preschoolers and of their capacity to learn. I remember thinking during that first seminar, what a good choice we have made. Gerry took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and proceeded to tell the participants, representing both creative and academic life in America, that researchers, educators, and producers were going to set curriculum goals together, and that the goals were going to be tailored to television and not to the classroom. I don't want to leave the impression that all went smoothly after that. I remember Sam Gibbon, one of our 3 producers, shouting out in dismay at one of the seminars, "Why don't you guys speak English?" There were what I call little nervous breakdowns among the creative people at each of the seminars, as they pondered what was being said by the advisors and how it might fit into a television show that children would actually want to watch. Gerry had a talent for translating academic language into English, and also for employing his genial personality to smooth the bumps. I don't think Gerry ever looked back, despite his original reservations, and there was never any question that he wanted to be any other place, and he was all over the place. He did not confine his interest in the workshop to the educational and research issues only. Hardly a day went by that I didn't call him about some administrative, personnel, public information, or production problem. Countless times he flew in from Cambridge on almost no notice because I would call and say, "Gerry, we've got a problem." And of course, these were my problems. There were also those of Dave Connell, Sam Gibbon, John Stone, and then of course Ed Palmer. He had the responsibility of designing and executing the formative research and working with Educational Testing Service on the design and execution of summative research. How Gerry, who also had a day job at Harvard, was able to do it, I'll never know. But we never could have been as successful without his generosity of his time, his knowledge, and himself. It was not merely reputation and brilliance in the field that Gerry brought to the endeavor. He also brought insight, common sense, and most important of all, his sense of humor. Without that, we never could have meshed so well together, and it was the meshing that made it work. And in the process, we all learned to speak the same language, and we also laughed a lot. After his retirement, Gerry wasn't well, but we exchanged an occasional note. Not long ago, he sent me a picture of his adored grandson, Sam, the light of his life, and I sent him a picture of my granddaughter, Chloe, the light of mine. Thanks to Ted, Gerry and I talked on the phone several times toward the end of his life. I told him I loved him, and he answered sort of irritably, as if to say, that's a given, but he answered, well, I love you too. He easily expressed how much he loved Stella, Nina, and Ted and Sam, how much pleasure they gave him, and how proud he was of them. St. Paul's Cathedral in London has a plaque referring to its architect, Christopher Wren, that reads, if you seek his monument, look around. About Gerry, I would say, if you seek his legacy, turn on a television set in any one of 180 countries. You will find his contribution to Sesame Street worldwide is as vital today as it was 43 years ago when Gerry first lit the spark. Thank you.
Thanks to Joan for that. And now, Milton, Rob, and Ellen and Dean, if you will make your way up here to join us. And while you do, this is the part of the panel where we move from Sesame Street to the world. And one thought I had about sort of making that transition was think about some of the people who studied with Gerry and then moved on to make major impact in either production or another creative task or in research or in education. One of those people is Amy Dorr. See her. Amy Dorr is the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences at UCLA. So you can't do much better than that in education and research. But in the early 70s, Amy was a assistant professor here in the Center for Research on Children's Television. There's Amy. She says back then, it seems to me that she looks almost identical in both pictures. That's impressive. Amy, again, sends her regrets. She had a death in her family last week, so wasn't able to be here. But I'm just going to read just a couple of sentences from remarks that Amy sent, remembering what she learned from Gerry. She says, Gerry was a very smart man and a very good person. He was the best mentor I've ever had in more than 40 years in academia. And today there are many parts of who I am and what I do that came from Gerry. Let me share a few of them, from the mundane to the most, to the really important. This will echo something that Sam said. My books are all lined up neatly, alphabetically at the edge of the bookshelf. I clean my office every summer. But also, I take direct responsibility for moving groups and projects along in their work. I believe in creating social science knowledge and putting it to use. I avoid the ain't it awful approach and look for the good that can be done. And finally, I continue to work to use media and technology to enrich children's lives. Thank you, Gerry, for what you gave me in our field. Most of all, thank you for what you've given generations of children and families everywhere. So that's from Amy Dorr. And then continuing to look at Gerry's legacy and impact, in the circles that spread out from Harvard and from Sesame Workshop is our next panel, starting with Milton Chen, former executive director of the George Lucas Educational Foundation, former student and faculty colleague of Jerry. Welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Can you hear me all right? Great. Wow. I was thinking about what to say here, and I just had to pause and take a deep breath, because my own professional path to being here today started almost exactly 40 years ago in 1971, if I've got it placed correctly. And it started across the street on the 4th floor of Larson Hall. I was a only slightly wet behind the ears Harvard sophomore. I had written a note to Joan Cooney. Can you imagine at the age of 18 writing a letter to the CEO of this organization that was achieving enormous popularity? I had noticed a little note in a Chinese American newsletter saying that they were looking for advice from Asian Americans about how to do a diversity curriculum on Sesame Street, and I thought, well, I'm hardly an advisor, but at least I'll write a letter saying I'm interested. And to her credit, Joan wrote me back in the fall of '71 and said, well, you're in luck. Because you're at Harvard, you can go across campus and meet with the chairman of our board of advisors, Dr. Gerry Lesser. I sometimes say that I went to the right school for the wrong reason. I come here thinking loosely I might become a civil rights lawyer. And I was working at the Center for Law and Education at the time. But from the time I met Jerry, it started a whole, now 40-year progression of a career that I could not have dreamed of. And Jerry was really the beginning. I remember the first day we met in his office on the 4th floor. And there he was in his trademark corduroy slacks and white tennis sneakers. The Bigelow Professor of Education and Human Development, with his casual style. And from the beginning, I think I was bitten by that bug. Just that way of relating to me as at a graduate school of education, a sophomore, and very welcoming, saying, yes, we're trying to start this new thing. And yeah, we've had tremendous success with this show called Sesame Street. We're trying to start this new thing called the Electric Company. And it's the first season. And we'd like to do some research on kids' reactions to the Electric Company. We'd like to, in his phrase, watch some kids watching the Electric Company. He made it sound so simple. So that spring, we started doing some formative evaluation on the first season of the Electric Company. And it came to be April. It was spring break. And Jerry said, we're going to have this little seminar in New York City. And we're going to have experts like Courtney Kasdan. I'm so pleased that Professor Kasdan is here, and Jean Shaw and others. So take stock of the first season. And we had been doing some observations, and Barbara Flagg was part of this group. David Rose was also there. Folks that many of you will remember and know their illustrious career since then. So again, for a Harvard undergraduate, by then I was all of, I think, 19, to have the chance to go to Lincoln Center, to meet a young executive producer named Sam Gibbon, and first season, in this large, light-filled room at Lincoln Center, to see this table where Jerry stood at the beginning, at the head of the table with his shirt sleeves and his remarkable way of introducing everyone, and to hear these reports. There was a young teacher of English at the time from Tennessee named Linda Roberts, who was also there, who went on to become the Director of Educational Technology at the Department of Education. But of course, I got bitten by the bug right then. And I remember that it was a 2-day seminar. It was my first trip to New York City. And Jerry said, well, why don't you stay for the second day? I said, well, I'd be glad to, but I hadn't brought a change of clothes. I'd come up from D.C., where I was visiting with my family. And he said, that's okay, we'll make arrangements for you. So they put me up at the St. Moritz on Central Park South. I was like this. I remember I ran into Jerry. There was a little gift shop right next to the elevators. And I ran into Jerry that night. And he said, well, did you get something to eat? I said, yeah, I'm fine. He said, no, there's a great place I used to go to around the corner that you might try. And it's probably the Carnegie Deli that Howard Clark mentioned. And he said, do you need anything? Maybe a pair of socks. And again, for the Bigelow professor at Harvard Education to say that to me, I had a chance to work with Fred Rogers. And Fred used to say this about our mentors, that some of these things that we learn from our mentors are caught and not taught. And these are things that I learned from Gerry, that this personal style, never to take yourself too seriously, always to be concerned about the people in the room and how they were doing, to reach out to even the youngest students. To this day, whenever I meet with an undergraduate or I hear from someone who wants to start a career in this field, I always make it a point to try to write back to them, to offer them a word of advice, to offer them a word of encouragement, just as Gerry did to me very early on. Well, those first experiences led to a career of working at Sesame Workshop, working with Keith Milk and others, on 321 Contact, on the electric company. I worked there for 5 years and, again, saw Gerry in action in those advisory board meetings, saw him in the way in which he would relate not only to the academic advisors, but to the staff. I later had the great fortune of coming back here to join Gerry on the faculty as an assistant professor. And one of the great honors of my life was to co-teach the course on designing television for children that Ron Slavey and Joe continued to teach with Gerry, who had been my professor. So it's a great honor to be back here to reflect on 40 years of influence that Gerry's had on my career. I'd just like to close by reading to you from a memo that Gerry wrote. I like to think of this as kind of an archaeological dig. Based on that first trip that Howard mentioned to China. It's a memo addressed to Joan Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, because, of course, he was there as part of a Harvard delegation. But as Gerry always did, he made time for Sesame Workshop. So in addition to all the visits with the Harvard delegation, he made a point to visit with the folks at China Central TV. He went to NHK in Tokyo, and he filed a very long report, very detailed, about all those meetings. And I thought that since it's now about 30 years later, this is written April 10th, 1980, it's cause for some reflection not only about the way in which Gerry opened up the workshop to the world, but also this relationship with China, which Gerry and others can tell you has really blossomed over the past 30 years. I'll just read you a few of his comments. He said, when I was invited to join a Harvard delegation to visit PRC, I used the opportunity not only to visit universities, but to meet with the broadcasters as well. The upshot for CTW is that opportunities for us in PRC are very great and immediate. In particular, their interest in our science show was enormous, and they also were fascinated by our work with NHK in using Sesame Street to teach English. He put a little footnote on the first page. The scholars in the room will appreciate this dispassionate note. In reaching this assessment, I have tried hard to factor out any unrealistic enthusiasm created by a visit to a place so different and unusual in my experience. Thank you, Howard. To correct for a gee whiz reaction, I have tried to give a conservative interpretation to what I saw here. I close on this personal note because that visit that Gerry made in the spring of 1980 led to Sam Gibbon and myself and John Stone going to Beijing in the fall of 1980. It was a life-changing visit, not only professionally, but personally for me, as my first chance to visit with my Chinese relatives in China. I sometimes say that I'm here totally as an accident of history. Between 45 and 49, my parents came from China. China was a friend of the U.S. in 1945, but it was the enemy in 1949. So I never had a chance to meet my family. I never knew my grandparents. But Gerry kind of opened the door to that as well. So for all of these experiences over now 40 years, I'm truly grateful to Gerry and to his family. It's great to see you all here. And to remember the ways in which Gerry reached out to me as a student and as a colleague, I remember very well a Thanksgiving dinner that we shared during my first year here in 1985. So thank you.
Well, Milt is an old friend from Harvard days and workshop workshop days, as is Rob will be in a bit. But our next two panelists are folks that I never had the pleasure of meeting until today, but have been huge fans of for decades because of your great research. So let me welcome Ellen Mortella, now at Northwestern University, and please tell us about your association with Gerry.
Well, from the moment that I got an email from Joe inviting me to speak here, I feel honored and privileged. Ever since I was, well, first of all, I was never Gerry's student. I was never a coworker or a colleague. I never collaborated on research with him. But Gerry Lesser was an aspirational figure in my life in two ways that I want to talk about. His book, Children and Television, which came out in 1974, I don't know if you can appreciate today what a profound book that was. It essentially established the notion that children's development and our understanding of children's development could be important in the creation of media products. Yeah. It established the notion that a developmental perspective was important in developing children's media products. When that book came out, I was a graduate student. And up to that point, I had read Schramm, Lyle, and Parker and their studies of how children used media in the 1950s, and Himmelwhite, Oppenheim, and Vince, research that had been gone on in England. But there really wasn't anything in the United States that could put in perspective this new perspective that one could study children and television issues from a developmental perspective. And that, secondly, that academics could actually have a role in creating quality educational television for children. At that point, I wasn't sure I wanted to be a children and television researcher. I was doing some work in communication studies, but I have to say that that book changed my mind. And the subsequent research that was done on the basis of that book. I Googled the book this past week, and there are literally hundreds of citations to the Children and Television book. It was enormously influential in establishing a way of doing research, and more importantly than that, an attitude that says that psychology and understanding of children is important in creating quality media. In fact, just yesterday I was at a meeting that the Fred Rogers Center organized to talk about applying a developmental perspective to new media and establishing standards there. That wouldn't have happened without Gerry Lesser. The second way in which Gerry Lesser was an aspirational figure was that he always was an academic, but he could talk to professionals in media production. Over my career, I realized that I wanted to be somebody who could do that as well. And I saw him run a seminar once, a meeting at the workshop. This was many years later, and I can attest he had his sleeves rolled up as well. But it wasn't that. It was that intelligence is one thing, and knowledge is one thing, but the ability to talk cross languages and cross professions, very few academics have that ability. Gerry had it in spades, and it was remarkable to watch that. I remember vaguely when I first met him, I'm trying to remember the date. It was sometime in the mid-'80s at the Gannett Center for Media Studies. Gerry was a fellow there, a senior fellow in the late '80s. And my memory is that he was working on international programs and looking at television around the world. I was a junior fellow at the same time. I was a young assistant professor. I think I was at Illinois at the time, I'm not quite sure. And I remember walking, he came into a large seminar where I was sitting, a seminar room, and we sat down and we talked. And I remember at the time thinking he knew a lot more about my research than a professor of Gerry Lesser's stature should have known. I was flattered. He was engaging, he was charming. Just as you said, he took the time to ask me about the work that I was doing. He taught me that no matter how successful and how accomplished, looking out at the world and seeing who else is out there doing interesting things is always important. I felt so proud of the fact that Gerry Lesser took time to talk to me that day. And I know I wasn't the only one. That was the style that he had with anyone who was interested in these areas. And so he was a gentleman. I don't mean to steal your thunder, but he was a mensch. He was a lovely person who set very high standards. So I feel very privileged today to be here to represent those in the field who were not as students and were not as collaborators, but who very much have been touched and have a legacy from Gerry Lesser. And so, thank you.
Many of us who are really interested in children and their welfare have spent more and more time in the last few years thinking about their health, and particularly their nutrition, exercise, and so on. Someone I've learned a lot about that from is Dina Borzowski from Johns Hopkins University. Well, I only learned fairly recently, was a student of Gerry's as well. So Dina, I'm glad to have you here. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be part of these panels. I'm towards the end of the panel, so I'm going to reiterate quite a few things that have been said, but there are some common themes here. I'm going to speak about Gerry Lesser, the professor, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that I learned from him and important lessons in being a good professor, or at least trying to be a good professor. My first relationship with Gerry came through Carla Seal Warner and Sam Gibbon, who were in the late 1980s, early 90s, were teaching. Yes, Sam was inside a university, teaching at Teachers College, Columbia. And the syllabus required the reading of the first 2 chapters of Gerry's book. And it was a fall day. It was Indian summer. It was warm out. I took the book. I read the first 2 chapters, and I didn't stop. I kept reading and closed the book. I'm a slow reader, so I was there for probably hours. But I finished the book, and I thought, is this guy still teaching? I need to go work with him. And I basically closed the book, went to Carla, asked for a recommendation, and said, I'm applying to Harvard. I want to go work with Gerry. Arriving at Harvard, one of the things that I learned about him, and one of the things that I try to do as a professor myself, is give access to my students. Give my students access to me. As many of you know, his door, when he was on that 4th floor, his door was open. And you could pop your head in, and there was always a smile. There always was a little banter back and forth of like, okay, what are you doing? Getting your work done? But having that open door policy of being there and available for your students. Another thing that I've learned from him is to be enthusiastic about your students. Now, many of you will remember he used to take attendance in his designing media class. So downstairs in the basement, he'd go through the list of everyone who was supposed to be there, and he'd stop at the name and make sure he had their nickname. It wasn't just their name, but it was their nickname, and he'd check in with every student. So trying to get to know your students, I have colleagues and peers who have gone through graduate students who have had advisories said, you know, your personal life's your personal life. I don't want to know about that. You just get... That wasn't Gerry's way. Gerry knew about your life. We laughed about the fact that I would take on the last name Borzakowski. And I remember very well him writing that name across his board, spelling it very, very carefully. It was up there for weeks. But he got to know me, and I got to know him, and it was an honor. But getting to know your students as real people. Another thing that he did that I hope to try to do with my own students is I make the work fun. Now, when he would teach a class, and you'd come to that basement room in the other building, and there was always a video playing. There'd be a Sesame Street song happening, and he'd be bopping around. And there was an expectation among the graduate students at Harvard University that you'd be bopping around too and be singing along. And it was always a great way to start a class. I try to do that too. So yes, I've stolen a little bit of his work, and I do play the videos before I start my lecture. Another thing that he taught me to do, and I hope to pass on to my own students, is to do meaningful work. That it's not just doing the little nuanced piece of research, but it's to have some sort of applied application to the work that you're doing. So if you're studying the impact of media on kids. Make sure it has some sort of meaning. And then the last thing that he taught me is that you have to publish it. You have to go on and you have to get that information out there. So it's not just enough to do really good research. You need to be able to write it. And I'll come back to the beginning. You needed to be able to write it down in a way that an audience can accept it and learn from it. And that's what his book did, and it was to start to the finish. So when I was about to finish my doctoral work, I went to Gerry and I said, you know, I have this idea of becoming a professor. And he said, don't do it. He's like, you don't want to go into academia. What a terrible idea. That's the worst thing for you to do. And I'm very grateful that I did as he did and not as he said. Because he was an inspiration. And Gerry Lesser, the professor, was something that I've taken to do in my own work. And hopefully my own students will then carry on that legacy.
Thank you, Dean. Just before I call you, Rob, I was just going to say, when I first imagined this gathering, I thought it would be really neat if we could have at least a few minutes of kind of a Quaker meeting style thing where people who aren't on the panel but who have something different that they want to share with us about Gerry could have a minute or two at the microphone to share. And I really want to thank all of our panelists on both panels for so carefully observing our request about the time limit for speaking that we'll actually have time to do that. I want to end this session by around 6:45 at the latest, because my understanding is there's a lull in the storm that's supposed to be so you can scurry off more safely. But I think we will take just a few minutes after our last speaker to share if you want to do that. And with that, I want to welcome an old friend, Rob Lippincott, who's been in the education and media business since a long time until talk about, I'm sure, and is now the Senior Vice President in charge of education for Public Broadcasting Service.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I came to HGSE in the fall of 1980. I was way too young to be an assistant headmaster, but I was, of an outdoor school up in Vermont based on Outward Bound model. And I actually had an incredibly deep suspicion of television. In fact, I basically considered it as an educator to be the enemy, the what you should escape and turn off and not pay any attention to. So it was kind of an irony that I enrolled in Gerry's course in the fall, because I was actually trying to get at what I'd heard so much about, the practical, these seminars that I thought were so intense and so wonderful. So I thought, okay, if I read some research and figure this out, maybe I can qualify to do some of that. And actually, Gerry had a huge impact immediately on how I think. And in fact, I think has had a long impact in what I've done. He very calmly put up a little 3-ring, what he called his heuristic, on the board when he first walked in. And he seemed to me to be able to sort of capture big ideas very carefully, but very succinctly. And this, I think the big idea, of course, is what Joan Cooney talks about, which is really a question that needs to be revisited all the time. Can television teach? Well, actually, it turns out, of course, it can. We know it can. We know it well. It can well now. But it also teaches things that we don't necessarily want it to teach. So it was important to really bring meaning and value to doing the research to make it teach what you wanted it to teach. And that became really an epiphany and something that I have really been captivated by. I was also captivated by a lot of other pieces of the Harvard experience. A lot of the students, I think, were doing wonderful things. A great course I took from Sam Gibbon was about interactive technology, which was, of course, in its real infancy at that point. But really, to me, brought the other part to media that I thought television does this great affective job. But the cognitive and the interactive was something really, really important. So I fell hard for interactive video discs, which Gerry quite, I think, sort of almost charitably included in video and television, because of course it really is kind of what television might grow up to be. In fact, a friend of my daughter's said to her, "Your parents are so old, they watch TV on a television set." Because of course it has morphed immensely in the 30 years that since I went to graduate school. In fact, I had a great privilege of being invited back shortly after finishing my master's degree, because Sam Gibbon was sent off to the great beyond in terms of television, which turned out to be The Voyage of the Mimi and A Voyage with the Maya, and creating really exciting, interactive, well beyond television curriculum. And I got the fabulous opportunity to teach his course because having secured a job at WGBH, I was a legitimate professional. And I recruited Sherry Robinson to help me with that. And then the next year, I recruited Joe Blatt to come from GBH over. And it turns out, of course, he was a ringer. He had been here all along. And indeed, he's a lifer as well. Someone who really gets it. So in a way, I've been going with the map that Gerry Lesser gave me on a voyage that Sam Gibbon inspired me to do. But it's been in pursuit of this notion that you really can use the science of discerning what's going on in the medium to really figure out if it's working. And I think applied to interactive technologies, in fact even software, we call it usability research. And in fact, a lot more science, I think, has been going into the human-computer interface on which makes now iPhones, is really derived from the same basic idea. Most recently, I've had a fabulous honor of being involved in a lot of work with a lot of the best kids producers in the world, because we've gotten a couple of grants from the Department of Education. This little study, in fact, I recommend to you, it's online at pbskids.org/read, because the Department of Education gave us a really gigantic challenge, almost a kind of Gerry Lesser style challenge, to use television and the media that it has become to help kids learn how to read. So of course, we rounded up not just Sesame Street, but certainly Sesame Street, but the new, all new, Singing and Dancing Electric Company, a program called Martha Speaks, some serious thinking that went into Between the Lions, a wonderful show that really is born of the same whole set of research principles called supervised from the Teachers College in Columbia, and another one called Word World. All together, those were the shows and the experiences that we produced as part of a literacy experiment. So the noble cause was literacy. The science was finally getting enough money, because the department required it. No producer would, of course, spend 20 to 25% of their money on research. They put it on the screen. But indeed, that was, I think, the core lesson of what the practicum and what Gerry brought to Sesame Street was about, was that if you take the time to what we learned in usability to call shop for the bad news, in other words, find out what's wrong, not just how incredibly cool you are for having made a great song or animation, but what didn't work. What's wrong with it? And in fact, what can you change to make it really work? That kind of humility is a deep humility in academic circles, but it's an incredibly deep humility in development circles where money is so hard to come by. When you get it, you want to express creativity. Finally, we were able to do that, and with television, with as few as 2 episodes of Super Y, 46% of the kids showed a significant gain in reading skills. With this curriculum forged out of these games, we were able to prove definitively in the What Works Clearinghouse of the Department of Education, a cohort of students, founding companies, rebuilding MIT, all kinds of things. And in fact, I think that there's never been a more interesting or exciting time in the media. It's not as if we have solved this problem, literacy or almost any of the learning problems, and it's not as if we've exploited the learning potential of the media. But we've learned how we might exploit it. And I think that's really the sort of my sense of the most enduring legacy that thanks to the Lesser family and thanks to Gerry.
Thank you all very much. So we'll take no more than about 10 minutes, 4 or 5 people, if you wish to add a new thought to recollections of Gerry. While we have microphones facing you so that you can be included in the video record of this that we're making for Stella and her family and for the school. I'm going to ask each of you who does want to contribute to be extremely brief so that everybody has a quick chance. And I just, while people are taking the microphone, I just want to say that I'm sure with your regrets from people that you will know who were planning to be here but couldn't be, just very briefly, Dan Anderson, who all of you know from UMass Amherst, a terrific researcher. Jerry Kagan from our own Department of Psychology here at Harvard. Norm Stiles, one of the partners, along with Chris, I know is here on Between the Lions. Carol Greenwald and Kate Taylor, who between them are the executive producers and authors of an extraordinary series of wonderful children's television shows from WGBH. And Nancy Sizer, who's a good friend of this school, all wanted to be here to be part of recognizing Jerry and wanted me to give you their regrets. Fine, thank you. Courtney, you want to speak first? Oh, sorry, Ed, I didn't see it.
I'm Ed Atkins, and I worked at CTW for about 14 years. I was the content director for 321 Contact. And I just want to expand the Asian experience. Milton talked about his introduction back to China. Just as we were finishing 321 Contact and we were trying to get ready to do Crow, which was an animated science series for children, there was kind of a gap in the amount of work that we were doing. And I thought, well, I'll go do something else for a little while. So I applied for a Fulbright scholarship. And being kind of naive about the whole thing, I just sent in these papers and bingo, I got one. And I didn't realize that you really had to set up things. You'd have to have a sponsor so that you'd have someplace to live wherever you're going to go. And I had gotten one to go to Japan. And so I went and talked to Keith Milkey, and he said, well, you know, Jerry had a sabbatical in Japan. Why don't you go talk to him? So I went to his office and said, gee, I've got this sabbatical, but I don't know anybody there, and I don't even know any institutions there. What am I going to do? And he just went to his desk, and he found a business card, and he took it out, and he went over to the Xerox machine, and he Xeroxed it and gave me this piece of paper, and I thought he was just blowing me off. So I took it home, and I wrote a letter to this person. And it turned out this person said, oh yes, come. She was a professor at KO. She was also a board member of NHK International, Educational, and NHK proper. And she's been a wonderful friend all these years, and I've spent, a year on the Fulbright there, but then since then, every year for the last 10 years, I go there about twice a year for several weeks. And the sponsor that he introduced me to has introduced me to all levels of Japanese society, all the way to the top, and maybe not quite to the bottom. But I've had a wonderful experience, and I just got off the plane from Tokyo and found that it was quite difficult to even get here, but managed to do it. Anyway, that's my story about Jerry.
Thank you for coming. Courtney, please, go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
I'm Courtney Kasdan. I was a colleague of Jerry's in human development for many years, now retired, also for quite a few years. And I think he got me involved in the seminars that have been described for Sesame Street. I think at the same one that Sam mentioned in 1968, spring of 1968. It was an absolutely gorgeous day in May, and the cab from LaGuardia drove me through Central Park on the way to the St. Moritz, that Bill mentioned, fancier than I would ever afford by myself in New York. And the seminars were one of the most stimulating academic collegial environments that I've ever had a chance to work in. It wasn't only that there were this disparate group of people that Jerry had deliberately assembled, and he also encouraged us to try and not only talk to each other, but try and sort of empathize the language and the needs of the people in the other group, so that somebody like me, who is totally bound to language, especially in its written forms, had to try and think in visual terms. What we were trying to talk about, what the processes of kids learning to read involved, how those might be shown in visual terms. And some of the aha moments when we managed to, people like me managed to click with people like the television writers, was just exhilarating. But I also want to mention something that's been implicit in what everybody has said, but I want to make it explicit. You've heard a lot about Gerry's qualities as a person and the qualities of his relationship with other people. I don't know what one word sums it up, maybe just kindness. And I'll take that as a sort of shorthand. What Gerry kept insisting through those meetings, and also often mentioned here on campus, about Sesame Street and the Electric Company, all the shows that CTW was involved in, was it was very important to him that all of the relationships shown on the show, whether among the puppets or among the people, the real live people, also had to exude those same kindly qualities to each other. It was remarkable, and something that I think we have to be especially not only grateful to Gerry, but learn from him.
Carla Steele Warner. I was fortunate to be a doctoral student of Gerry's and had one of those coveted offices without windows on the fourth floor of Morrison Hall. And I just wanted to say a few things about Gerry as a professor that echo some of the things Melton and Joe and others who've been fortunate to study with him said. One was that he had this casual elegance about him that really was unmatchable. I mean, I have these memories of walking into whatever class he was teaching, and he would, as in that New York style, have the crisp folded newspaper right to the column where he wanted to read a quote. Every day he began the class with a relevant quote. And it would sort of focus you like a laser on what the issue of the day was. Sometimes it was even like a New Yorker cartoon. But they were always the most poignant things. And it sort of made you realize that you were part of this bigger world, and what you were doing was relevant and had meaning to kids all over the place, ultimately all over the world. The other thing was that as a teacher, it was trial by fire learning. There was nothing that Gerry assumed you could do anything. He would throw a research project at you, a course or a speech or anything. And so there was this bizarre opportunity to do a research project for the Agnelli Foundation, which was Fiat in Italy. And he said, "You're Italian, you speak Italian, you're interested in stereotypes, and so let's do this project." So anyhow, fast forward, cooked up this really cool research project, and we did it. And then, he said, let's write it up, and I wrote a speech for him to give. And then he said to me, I'm not going to give this speech. You're going to give this speech. And I was terrified. But anyhow, I thought, okay, well, I'll rise to the occasion. I'll try to do this. And I was walking out of his office after he had told me that I was going to be giving his speech. And he said, well, just one other thing. There's another person who's going to be on the panel with you. You might know who he is. His name is Mario Cuomo. Anyhow, he had great faith in us, and it really made us raise the bar for ourselves. And then finally, just one very tender personal story. My mother passed away when I was finishing my dissertation, and after I got back from taking care of the family business, I went back into my office at Larson Hall, and uncharacteristic of me, as usually a very gregarious person, I closed my door. And every day, Gerry found an excuse to come down and knock on my door. And I would hear the squeaking sneakers, so I always talked to Gerry. And he'd knock on the door and he'd say, oh, you know, I've been thinking about this article in the New York Times. Or, you know, he always had some excuse. And he did this for about 4 days in a row. And then the last day, he turned around and he looked at me and said, you know, I think it'd be better for you if you kept your door open.
Well, so many eloquent remarks from you and from both of us. Not just yet, Jason. That was going to be our big close. It's in my hand. I hope it was for Stella and Nina and Ted, Sam. I'm sure hard to hear in some ways, but I hope also wonderful to hear all these really fresh and robust memories. I think for all of us, it's hard to face up to the fact that, pardon my quoting the Sesame Street bit that many of us know so well, that he's really not coming back. And that's hard. But it's pretty fabulous, if you can't be here, to have the kind of legacy that we've heard about over the last hour and a half, and have brought all of us together. So thank you all so much for coming and sharing your memories, and we're just keep remembering Gerry and dedicating ourselves in the spirit that he represents that we've heard about. Thank you.